Welcome to Grow Money Business, the podcast dedicated to helping business owners optimize income, pay less in tax, and invest prudently. Here's your host, Grant Bledsoe.
Hello, everybody. Grant Bledsoe here. Welcome back to Grow Money Business. This week on the show, our guest is Professor Scott Christianson from the University of Missouri. Professor Scott is a professor of business and technology at the University of Missouri's Business School and joins us today to update us all on the landscape of generative AI, generative artificial intelligence, cryptocurrencies, and CBDCs, which is an acronym for central bank digital currencies. This is a really fun conversation. In general, I am a huge proponent of having guests on from an academic setting, because while we all have our blind spots, we all have our biases, professors who are in the business of teaching this stuff for a living are generally a lot more objective than the other people we might see across industry, across social media, and other guests we might have on the show. So Professor Scott joins us today to update us on all these areas, which are really important for investing, really important for sound financial planning, and honestly, the world we live in today. Professor C has just a really great demeanor, and when he puts on his teaching hat, you'll know what I'm talking about once we jump into the episode. It's just easy to listen to him explain complex topics that are outside of my own personal wheelhouse and just hear him in his lectures. Hey everyone, I need to interject quickly to remind you all that nothing found in today's episode or any other episode of Grow Money Business should be considered financial, investing, legal, tax, fitness, or even relationship advice. It's content that you're free to use and to deploy on your own terms. And before taking any actions on content found on the show, please do consult with your tax professional, your attorney, or your financial planner. If you don't have a financial planner, head on over to threeoakswealth.com to learn more about what we do in terms of financial planning and investments and how we help clients on an ongoing basis. There we go. We are live. Scott, welcome back to the show. Really good to see you again.
Thanks for having me again. It's great to be back.
It's been, maybe 2 years or so since you joined us last. There's been a whole hell of a lot that's happened in the world since then. We were just talking about central bank digital currencies as being one topic that I'd love to cover because you know a lot more about that than me. AI, both from an industry perspective, but also you're a professor of business, and I'm curious how your students and yourself are interacting with this interesting, cool new tool. And then cryptocurrency as well. So I'm really looking forward to covering all those topics. Where should we take it first? Where do you want to start?
It was about a year ago that I started emailing my dean at the time frantically saying, hey, we need to be looking at this ChatGPT thingy, and, here's all the output I've created. And I had just assumed that, like everybody else, the dean followed, the latest tech news. But he, I think, kind of ignored me a little bit until we got to his Christmas parties with donors, and encountered a donor and said, "Oh, it was great. We used ChatGPT to write our entire 2023. This was a year ago. 2023 catalog of products, and we did it in half a day." And so then I got an email like, can you explain to me what this is again? so a lot has changed in the past year or so. And so that's been interesting development. And it's probably been kind of like the other topics we wanted to cover, a little bit overhyped to some degree. But it, I think, is already a useful tool if you know how to use it correctly. So we can start there if you want.
Let's do that. Yeah. So why don't you give us the landscape of where are we with AI? ChatGPT was probably the first. There's been a whole lot of news about the CEO of OpenAI recently. There are more competitors entering the space. What does the landscape look like right now?
Yeah, so it's interesting. These things have been around actually for a while. Google invented some very important technology called the transformer, basically being able to take large data sets of language and being able to understand how that language is put together in a statistical model that allows it to then predict or produce new language. And some people have criticized these systems, and I think rightly so, saying these are not magical systems that really understand our world. These are stochastic parrots. And stochastic is just one of those fancy academic words for statistics. And so it means that it's kind of like a parrot. A parrot might say something, but does it really understand, a red car? Does it know what that means? Does it know the world of cars? Does it understand that there's other types of cars? Does it understand roads and everything else that you and I or a child might be able to understand? But even if they are stochastic parrots, they can be very useful, right? So, and we might even think, well, how often are we acting like stochastic parrots, right? So if I said to you, Grant, the train is leaving
Station.
the station. Now, why didn't you say terminal or port or anything else? Well, because statistically, it's most likely I'm going to say station. That word is most associated with those other words. So a lot of the way that we put together writing, especially very formulaic writing, is kind of based on statistical patterns. And so this can be a very useful tool to, I think, everybody. But it isn't magic. It is just statistics. And that's why these things will make mistakes. So we don't, if it comes back with information that's not correct, we don't say it's lying. We say it's hallucinating, right? So it was actually Cambridge University, their dictionary, their lexicographers that put together their dictionary, named hallucinate as the word of the year this year. All because that's this word that's come into a new context with AI. And we say it because it's stringing together words that sound good, right? Statistically, these sound great, but may not be true. For example, early on, I asked one of the large language models, ChatGPT, Bard, Claude, these are kind of the big three right now. Tell me about Harry S. Truman. So I'm here in Missouri, and he's the man from Missouri. We're very proud of Harry S. Truman. But one of the things that it put out in his essay was that after he left office, he was very well liked. Well, that was not true immediately after he left office. It was 20 years later that people reflected and said, oh, he was really a good president. But, he integrated the army. He was the guy who fired MacArthur. He was not well liked when he left office. And so, but it sounds good. It's, makes kind of like the station, right? It sounds good, but it wasn't correct. And so we've had to kind of cope with that. Um, and you were asking a little bit beforehand, how do I, in the intro, how do I approach this with my students? And we try to approach it as another tool in our arsenal, right? So another way that we can do a lot of this kind of formulaic writing. And what I've been doing with my graduate students is I allow them to use these tools, but then if they write a paper and they use these tools, they have to do two things. One, they have to own every fact in there. So, Grant, if you were my student and you submitted something that was factually wrong, you're going to get like 50% off. Okay. You're going to get a big ding there because you trusted this AI that you shouldn't trust.
Hopefully, you're knocking the scores of originally written papers that are also factually wrong, whether or not they're using AI to assist, right?
Yes, we always knock it, but that idea that you're just going to say, oh, well, the AI said that, right? So it's not quite the same. But what I require them to do is to put an end note where they reflect on how they used it, how well did it work in certain circumstances, how well did it help their paper, or did they get new ideas? Did they brainstorm? Did they make an outline? How did they use that? And then reflect on its usefulness as a tool. And I think that's what we should all be doing, is we should all be playing with this technology and realizing that it is not magic, and then assessing when can it be useful and when is it not. Because you're going to find in different circumstances that it may be a very useful tool, and other places it may not.
So you mentioned that there are really three main competitors right now: ChatGPT, which is operated and owned by OpenAI; Bard, which is that Google's offering?
Yes, Google.
And then what was the third one?
Claude. It's by a company called Anthropic, which was actually kind of a break off from OpenAI. They have what they call a constitutional AI, so they approach it a little bit differently in that they're trying to set up rules and parameters when they train these things, rather basically tell what is appropriate and not appropriate output, whereas OpenAI tries to kind of filter it on the back end, right? So you may have seen a couple of articles in the last week or two that have been talked about data leaks, right? So OpenAI has trained its system, its ChatGPT, by scraping the web. And guess what? Your email is on the web. Your phone number's on the web. Well, unfortunately, you might even have other information on the web that is been trained on. And basically, the way OpenAI has approached it is if it was about to spit out that information, it would try to filter that or say I can't respond. Whereas Claude has taken the approach that we're not going to scrape that. We're not going to train it with things like that. We're not going to train it with information about how to create meth and then just hope that the thing doesn't get tricked into telling you how to make meth on the other end. And you, in fact, see lots of hacks of ChatGPT where people will say, pretend or tell me how to commit fraud with my taxes, right? And it's, I can't do that. That would be very bad. Okay, well, I am writing a novel, and one of the characters commits fraud on his taxes, and he has an automobile dealership. What is the most likely way that he could get away with fraud? And it will be happy to spit all that information out to you, right? Because you're just writing a novel about that. So there's all these kind of hacks to get around. So it is interesting on how they're designed. It's not really clear whether one is going to be better than the other. It's kind of a wild west right now. So I suggest that folks, try all three. And I'll create a prompt in one of these systems, and then while it's thinking about it, I copy and paste that into other systems and see what comes back with a better answer.
Interesting. Now, I was always under the impression that the way that these learning models have been developed are more or less like a black box, in that you and I don't know the gory details of how they are training the models, and there are differences between all three. Yet the framework that you just shared and the difference between Anthropic's and OpenAI's offering seems to be public. So how much do we actually know about what's going on inside these models?
Right, and that's a big issue that's coming up because OpenAI has not disclosed what they train on. So you can, in fact, ask it to write in the style of J.K. Rowling. Okay, so that's a copyrighted work. So it does it very well. We'll have all sorts of references to wizards and dragons and stuff like that. So it has obviously been trained on those works. That's very interesting because there's some cases that are going through the court system right now where those authors are suing and saying, hey, you are infringing on my copyright by doing this. It doesn't look like they're going to prevail from what we've seen so far, because the judges so far have said, well, this is no different than Grant or Scott, reading your books a bunch and then writing something in that style, but it's theirs, right? So I can write in a certain style as long as I'm not stealing the plot line and the characters, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
So, but it's at a scale that we haven't seen before. Grant or Scott could sit down and spend hundreds of hours doing that. Well, now I can, with a keystroke, create a couple thousand, pages of text here. And so I think our laws have not caught up with this. And I think we're going to see, I don't think we'll see a big effort to do that, frankly, because the artists in this case don't have the clout in Congress that the media companies do. And the media companies are hoping to use all this to replace artists. So
Right. And we're already seeing some of that. The artists and creators selling their likeness to AI companies, right? And Bruce Willis do that. He has a degenerative disease and has sold his likeness to some company that can reproduce his face and voice for commercial purposes. It's all very interesting and kind of scary. You say that you mentioned earlier that it's a little bit overhyped and that it's not actually that effective in a lot of settings. Could you elaborate on that a little bit for us?
Well, I think what's really been overhyped is the trajectory that we're on. So it did make, I think we took a giant leap forward with ChatGPT 4 and with Bard and Claude. But it's not clear that, this is now going to be uh, a perfect system like you might have seen in the Star Trek computer or, Commander Data on one of those Star Trek episodes. It's not going to be like that in 5 years. Whereas I think people were saying we're going to get to a general artificial intelligence. It's not clear that that's going to be the case. And if so, it's going to be an intelligence very different than humans. So that might not be even the correct word to use. The other thing is, we talked about those hallucinations. It's not, I've yet to see any sort of scientific paper or methodology that would prove that you don't have a hallucination. And so it's an inherently statistical model. And so because of that, there is some, distribution differences. And so you're going to have an element of randomness. And I just don't think that we're going to be able to rely on turning over different functions entirely to these systems because we won't know if they are hallucinating or not.
Right, right. So you mentioned the example of the donor that you met at the Christmas party that had just produced their entire annual catalog in far less time than they ever had before. There are a lot of practical commercial applications of these things in a relatively safe setting. I think an example of that is, we create these podcast episodes in my office. We do short little videos that are related to financial planning, and we have to come up with titles and intros and all that.
Yep.
And I don't have any training in copywriting myself, and so I asked ChatGPT to come up with 25 or 30 different compelling headlines, and then I just kind of pick and choose over the ones that I think sound the best.
Yeah.
And it is exceptionally helpful for that kind of thing. But I'm not asking ChatGPT to produce the entire blog post, which would be an entirely different animal. What?
Yeah, and you would also be able to verify whether that is in fact the content of your podcast.
Right.
So if it's Grant talks about to Professor Christianson about longevity, well, that's not exactly the content of this, right?
Yeah.
And so I always tell my students, don't ask these systems anything that you don't already know or are willing to go verify.
Okay, that's a good rule of thumb. And how much effort do you think that it takes to verify a lot of these outputs?
Well,
Seems like a substantial lift.
it can be. You can ask it to provide references,
Okay.
and it will actually provide links out. Google Bard is moving a little slower, but I think they obviously have a lot of information about what's out on the internet. And so if there's a little button at the bottom and you can say check or give me references for this, it'll then highlight the text. Anything in green, it says, I have found something on the internet that backs me up on this. But anything in red, it'll say this is a likely hallucination. So, but it may provide a link to an external website. And so I think that's one way that you can do that. I've also used it to summarize academic papers or to compare or highlight differences between them because I can actually upload the entire paper. I've already read the paper, but I want to have a nice summary that I can put in my notes. And, that might be, I might say, summarize this with an emphasis on this particular aspect of the paper. And it can do it much quicker than I can. But I do know that is in fact, or I can verify that is factually correct because I read the paper itself.
Right, right. One thing that's been particularly useful to me as well that I haven't figured out how to verify yet is the functionality where, I read something cool about quantum physics. I don't know quantum physics at all, but I can ask ChatGPT to explain it to me like I'm in third grade. And I took physics in high school and college and all that, but I'm kind of at the third grade level currently, and they're able to dumb it down into my level of understanding, and they can really do that across any topic. How would you suggest we verify what they're saying in those kinds of circumstances where the topic itself is kind of above and beyond my knowledge base.
Yeah, I think one of the things is that you can give it, some of these systems, you can upload a PDF that will actually have the information in it, and that means it's pulling directly from that PDF. The other thing is you could have somebody that is generating that does know the difference. So, for example, let's say I'm a new business owner. I come to you and we sat in your office for an hour and I still don't get the difference between accrual and cash-based accounting. And you could say, okay, write a story that explains the difference, like Scott was a 5-year-old, right? And you could look over that story and say, okay, this will help Scott get there. And that's one of the things that we're seeing a lot with elementary, secondary education teachers using this to develop lesson plans, to develop activities, to come up with new ideas on how to explain things. And I've used this in my own class for these purposes. But I remember one exercise. I wanted to explain machine learning, and I wanted to create an exercise using a certain system that my students would use to create a machine learning algorithm. And it knew about those systems, wrote it all up. Now I had to go verify one or two things, just because I wanted to make sure that was correct. But I knew all the rest of it was correct.
Oh, very cool. That's a great idea. And when we're communicating complex topics, financial planning related with clients, we're always trying to use different analogies and kind of skip between the low level technical stuff and the high level 30,000 foot level. Sometimes it's difficult to come up with an analogy on a fly, but I like the idea of using that to add more to our Rolodex there. So what are the broad scale implications for industry here? I mean, there's huge efficiency that seems like it can be gained from this. Do you think it's going to put a lot of people out of jobs? What professions will be impacted?
Yeah, I mean that's the big question. I think that you are going to see certain kind of more formulaic things, such as blog post content. So people that produce content for other websites. I have a former student that runs a business like that, and she's having to rethink her whole business strategy because she realizes while she might be able to retain her current clients, the odds of getting new clients are going to be lower and lower. And then how can she use these tools to basically say to her current clients, okay, now your bill is in half of what it was. She's working in a specialized industry, but I do think that there's going to be possible, big transformations. I do think that there's a lot of CEOs that are overly optimistic as to how easy it's going to be to deploy this technology. Most technology is not a technology like fire. Fire is a wonderful technology. You get a benefit from just being near it. It gives you light, it gives you warmth, right? But it's kind of like a lot of technologies that we've seen, unless you have the effective training, the ability to figure out how you're going to adopt it, what are the use cases where it actually is more effective, or whether we're just spinning our wheels using the fancy new thing. I remember probably 15, 20 years ago, if you remember, Palm Pilots were a thing back in the day, and some of your listeners will be of my age and remember those with great affection. And there was a big effort to let's teach math in elementary with Palm Pilots. And okay, so you bought $30,000 worth of Palm Pilots. That was great for it was either Palm or 3M or whoever was 3Com that was making the Palm Pilot at the time. But there was no, the studies actually showed there was no difference, right? So you're using the newfangled stuff, but it wasn't clear that there was any benefit to doing so. It still took the same amount of time, still took the same amount of teachers, all that kind of stuff. So I think that there's actually a lot more questions that this raises. So I think some of the CEOs that have been surveyed, you see some of them saying, 60%, 80% are going to adopt this technology in the next year. And I'm sitting there going, yeah, well, good luck.
Right.
I'm not sure everybody on your is going to be up to speed with that. So
Right. Yeah. I do remember Palm Pilots. I am just old enough to have owned one at one point, actually. So, I just lost my train of thought. I've been pretty good at not losing my questions, Scott, but for some reason, I just turned
Oh, that's
40 a
okay.
couple weeks ago, and for some reason, it's turning a corner on me all of a sudden. Um, here's what it was. From an investment perspective, and it seems like any company that's adjacent to AI, all they've had to do to get investors and capital pools excited about what they're doing is just get up in front of a stage and a record phone and record themselves saying the letters AI, and their understanding of that and their application of that is just going to lead to excess returns here down the road. And an example of that I've been wondering about and don't know very much about is NVIDIA's place in all this. They make chips. My understanding is that they have some thing that they're doing to where their chips are more AI capable than anybody else's, and their stock has just gone through the roof over the last 12 months. It's come back down to earth here a little bit more recently. What is NVIDIA's part in all this?
Well, they're the to use the old analogy for gold mining. They're not the gold miners; they're the ones providing the picks and axes, right? And that's kind of the business you want to be in some ways, because that's probably a lot more reliable business. They, of course, made the picks and axes for cryptocurrency as well, and unfortunately, there is this dominance of this company. And, a lot of this is all made in Taiwan, which is not really sure geopolitically how stable that will be. So I think as far as an investment, they do some fantastic work, but that may be overvalued. And it's also interesting to see that even OpenAI is looking at how do we make our own chips, right? And Google has done this to some degree in the past and might continue to do that. Google, I think, is the one that is probably more likely to figure this out in some ways. I also am very interested in what Apple will do. Um, Apple is very good about coming into a market late, and but coming in with a technology that is very seamless for the end user to adopt. And if they are able to do something like solve this problem with hallucinations and then integrate this into their products or integrate it into the desktop, that I think becomes very interesting, because there's a lot of things on my desktop that I'd like to easily automate, and that an AI should be able to figure out pretty easily, but that don't translate into using some of these other language models. But so I think that's one thing to consider. Um, I think, yeah, I think that Google is going to be very interesting. I think Apple's going to be very interesting as well. Some of these other ones, Anthropic. Actually, getting into crypto, the whole debacle with FTX, people are actually buying the claims against FTX because they happen to have made a very early investment in Anthropic, the makers of Claude, and that company may be worth tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars, and in fact, those claims may fully pay out. So people are buying those claims for 20 cents on the dollar and then holding them, hoping that when the dust is settled, those claims will be made full, and they'll be able to make a good chunk of change off of that. So
I've heard rumors of that, and there's always some lean, some claim that's just a long shot option that people are willing to roll the dice on. Seems a little bit far fetched, but hey, for the right person, that's perhaps interesting.
yeah.
Before we move on to cryptocurrency, what is it about NVIDIA's chips and picks and axes, as you call it, that makes their product far and away better than anybody else's right now?
I'm not really an expert to talk on that. I think they do own some substantial patents for the way these chips work that are very good for these types of calculations. So it may be a combination of skill and luck as far as the path that they pursued for their chip design. I'm sure others will catch up eventually. So, but they've done a pretty good job of maintaining that lead in lots of different areas for a long time. So,
Yeah. Okay. So cryptocurrency, Bitcoin over the last, 12 months, 18 months has been hammered in general after hitting, some pretty high peaks. And then more recently, it started to bounce back here closer to $40,000 a coin. And a lot of the rumors are well, more than rumors, this is actually happening. All the fund managers, the investment fund managers, are bombarding the SEC with applications to bring spot ETFs to market. The SEC has not allowed any of these yet, but it seems like the wheels are in motion to actually push this stuff through. And for our listeners out there, we've talked about this a little bit on the show. The existing investment funds you can invest in that have Bitcoin holdings, your money is not actually going into Bitcoin. It's going into futures contracts based on Bitcoin's price. And so what the value of your investment will go up and down in a way that's related to the Bitcoin price, but it's not the actual thing. And that's a really important difference in characteristic. The SEC has been reluctant to allow spot Bitcoin funds, which means that you give the investment manager your money, they take your money and then go buy actual Bitcoins and hold it in trust somewhere, because in general, the industry has been really unregulated. But they're moving in that direction. And Scott, I'm curious to hear your perspective on how this is playing out and how closely you've been following this recently.
I haven't been following it too close, but I will tell you that my general philosophy is that Bitcoin is going to always be it's a speculative asset. It's not a commodity currency like gold. It doesn't have any actual value or any utility. It's obviously not backed by any sort of other government. So there is a lot of people that are long-term holders that have a belief that government shouldn't be in the business of making money. So the Austrian school of economics kind of line of thinking, as well as people that are just mad at the government that they quote unquote print more money. So there's a lot of sociological stuff like tied up in this as well about philosophy of money and as well as just huge speculators. So I generally say it's like anything else, art or other speculative assets. If you really think it's cool, it's kind of fun to put a little money into it. But I think if I was to actually look at a cryptocurrency investment right now, I'd look at like Ethereum, which actually has the ability to create applications on top of its payment system. So I think in the long term, I see a lot more potential there for developing smart contracts, digital asset management, other things that are still being built. And it takes quite a while for these things to, build up and gain momentum. But I think there's some real applications there. So I have frankly just not been that interested in the Bitcoin side of stuff. It's an interesting technology. The ledger technology behind it is interesting. But I think in many ways, the thinking has moved beyond that. And we're still seeing like people just wanting to get rich quick, right? And there's also another adage kind of in line with the gold miners and the selling the axes and picks, which is by the time you've heard of it, it's already too late.
Yeah,
right.
That's right.
So any of these things where people have gotten rich, by the time you hear about it, it's probably too late.
Yep. Yeah, I concur with all that. It is definitely a speculative asset. The appeal of it to a lot of people, as you put it, is there's general distrust in the government's ability to maintain price stability, which is, of course, why the Federal Reserve exists. And they have they're trying to maintain the stability of prices of goods that we buy and sell here in the United States, and they're trying to promote full employment. And a lot of times they print money and devalue the dollar. That's what's happened to every single fiat currency that's ever existed since the beginning of time, as I understand it, because governments who control the printing press realize that over time their countries and their economies will be better off by doing that. So the appeal to me is that if you're so distrustful that the value of your dollar is not going to remain stable, then there's something that is unattached from that. But it is not an alternative in the sense that I think a lot of people believe it is. It is a speculative asset, as you put it. For Ethereum, I always thought that the biggest appeal of it was exactly as you put it, the opportunity for smart contracts. That can really displace a lot of the way that our society works right now. I mean, you have no need for title companies in real estate transactions. You have your insurance contracts can work totally differently. And basically you just code conditions under which the money will be transferred. And if those conditions are not true, nothing happens, right? Is that a reasonable summary of a smart
Right.
contract?
And they can be extremely complex. So another thing that was kind of hyped up was the NFTs a while back.
Yeah.
I think the last time we talked, that was the big thing in the news. And those are very interesting too, because I could sell a digital asset such as a digital painting to you, but I could put into that smart contract not only the details about our exchange, but I could any future exchanges, so that I always get 5% of any subsequent sales or something like that. So there's some very interesting ways that you can write contracts and code there. And I think that over the long term, that has a lot more potential. Bitcoin is, like I said, it's not even really a commodity currency. It's just um, it's kind of like in the 1500s, the Dutch kind of got caught up in tulips. So I got a tulip bulb here, and I think this is worth $100,000. Okay, well, that's fine if we all believe that. But the day that we figured out that, like, oh, it's kind of ridiculous, then that you can see a really significant price decline. You mentioned I think it got up to 41,000 last week, and then had a precipitous drop off by several $1,000s. So if you like roller coaster rides, you might want to invest a little bit in Bitcoin. But if you don't want to do that 24/7, you don't want to ride a roller coaster for the rest of your life, you might want to think about other ways to invest your money.
Yeah, yeah. And looking at all of this now too, a lot of these coins that have been created, definitely NFTs. A lot of these just crazy new fangled assets that people claim are going to take over the universe, I think are exact products of low interest rate policy for a long period of time. Money was just so easy to borrow for such a long period of time that until about 2 years ago, you could still get a 30-year mortgage for like 3.25%. That is darn near free. And then rates go up dramatically over a relatively short period of time. And it just takes asset classes a little time for the wind to come out of their sails, basically. And I think that's exactly what the NFT market is pretty much collapsed, as I understand it, and cryptocurrencies have definitely come back to earth. Although Bitcoin's rallied here a little bit recently. Am I off on that at all from your perspective?
Um, Yeah, I think, we have had some small inflation relative to the rest of the world. I realize that when I say small, some people may not think that when they look at the grocery store bill. But if you look, we really are pretty blessed here in the United States with the way uh, we do have a stable dollar relatively. And I mean, look at what just happened in Argentina yesterday, where the new president said it used to be $400, 400 pesos to $1, and now it's going to be 800. So the value of everything you had just went down in half. So that's real inflation, right? Or deflation, I guess, or I don't know. It all gets very confusing, especially in a different currency to me. But uh, yeah, so I think once again, there's this idea that you're going to get rich, right? And I saw a very interesting podcast with a gentleman who just wrote a book called "Number Go Up," and which he got into the Bitcoin culture, and it's like, oh no, the numbers go up. And I think there's also that, Sam Bankman-Fried, you and I have enough gray hairs to know that numbers don't always go up, right? So they eventually come down, and markets figure this out and live through the mania. I started my business shortly before the dot-com bubble, in a tech business, and so lived through that, and then I was this. It kind of you learn from experience, right? So then when we got to 2007, 2006, and a lot of the banks I was dealing with were like expanding so rapidly, I'm sitting there going, this is not going to continue. It always comes down. So numbers also go down. But I think that's a interesting book that people might want to check out.
I've not heard of it. Who's the author?
I can't pronounce his name, but it's Number Go Up.
Number Go Up. I like the
Yeah.
title a lot. That encapsulates
Yeah.
the culture pretty well. So you mentioned Argentina. Argentina just had an election. They brought in a guy who has a kind of a crazy look to him. I don't know the guy's name. And part of his platform was that he was going to peg the Argentinian currency to the US dollar, as I recall. Is that accurate?
Right.
And so I suspect that the adjustment in their currency was a direct result of the movement toward that peg, because you have to keep some substantial currency reserves that you're using to buy and sell in the open markets to make sure that the value of your currency remains in a tight band against the currency you're pegging to. Does that sound right?
You would know more than I on this particular aspect, but I know that there's several countries that do that. So when I was in Trinidad, it's always 6 Trinidadian dollars to $1.
Yep.
And I don't know that they really exchange for anything else.
Yeah. Okay.
But they always use that rate. And the American dollar is used for most settlements. So even if Argentina is settling something with Mexico, it's going to go into dollars first. So in some ways, that may make a lot more sense in the long term.
Yeah, it promotes. I had to do a paper on it in college, and as I recall, it promotes a lot of stability if your country is going through other issues and growing pains. You just take some of that price fluctuation for all the goods and services that are being imported and exported just out of the equation entirely. But you have to have sufficient cash in the central bank in order to support that, because if you run out, obviously your controls over the value are going to go away. That's been a while since I've thought about that. So on the same note, though, central bank digital currencies is something that we talked about last time that you were on, that I'm hoping you have some insights on, because China is using them all over the place. I know that other countries have adopted them to varying degrees of success. What is a CBDC, and where are we right now? What does the landscape look like?
Yeah, so COVID kind of put a little bit of a pause on some of the developments, but we still see active projects in the US as well as in Great Britain and in Europe to look at a digital dollar or digital pound or digital euro. And basically, it would be a way to kind of eliminate, if you will, the cash economy, the current dollars that we have, right? So dollars are nice; they have some advantage, but they also have some disadvantage. You find that a lot of crime is done using cash, right? So there's a lot of reasons why the government might want to discourage the use of cash or provide an alternative that would have the same functionality. But we're really, those of us in the West are really suspicious, I guess, of the government having such access, because right now we have intermediaries such as Visa or other places that intermediate between us and any sort of central bank or central settlement that goes on. And while certainly, law enforcement can ask for those records with a warrant, it's not something that's easily tracked by our government to just track what Scott's spending his money on. That might be advantageous as well. You talk about economics. Okay, well, it looks like white goods, we don't have to wait for the report to come out. We now know instantaneous what's actually selling. How many washing machines were bought today? Do we need to change the tax rate on washing machines to, make sure that, those are being bought in sufficient quantity or not sufficient quantity? So there's all sorts of good reasons why you might have that. However, it certainly seems to me that there's especially when you get in the hands of authoritarian governments, it's very disturbing. And I think it's like many technologies, once you adopt it, you're probably not going to go back, right? Typewriters are kind of fun, but we're not going back, right?
Yeah.
And maybe there's something that's useful in slowing down things a little bit, not having things as instantaneous, not having them as transparent. Now, of course, I say that, and of course, then everybody's worried about their privacy, but they go on Facebook and dump all this stuff.
Right.
Know every single thing about you,
Yeah.
and scan your phone and stuff. But so I think I've been kind of surprised that these efforts have continued. Frankly,
Really?
they don't seem to be very successful.
Efforts you mean in the U.S. and the U.K. or
Efforts in
everywhere?
the U.S. and U.K. It seems like things are kind of on the back burner. They're still in the kind of research stage right now. So I think Western governments will be probably the last to adopt these, but we do see other countries that have currencies that are unstable, that are easily counterfeited. Thank you. So, sorry. Um, Adopting these technologies, or wanting to get rid of the cash economy. So in Nigeria, that was one of the incentives, because everything was done in cash and not always Nigerian cash, right? So they were trying to really promote this digital dollar. But they thought, well, this will work great because a lot of people use Bitcoin. Well, the reason people go use Bitcoin is because they want to avoid the Nigerian dollar, which has huge fluctuations.
Right.
And despite the fluctuations we've talked about with Bitcoin, it can be much less than some of the currencies in these other places. In fact, the example I give to my students is like, if you're in some of these countries and you get paid, you might want to buy toasters because they're going to hold value better than the local currency. And in fact, for a while in Venezuela, people would do this. They'd buy a CD player and they could trade the CD player for stuff, but they didn't want to have, a wheelbarrow full of currency
Right.
that they had to, was getting totally devalued. And now you can buy a cookie for a wheelbarrow full of currency or something like that. So,
Right. Yeah. So I can see the benefits, especially from a reporting perspective. And if you're a government official trying to make a decision on monetary or fiscal policy, having all that data on the transactions from yesterday at your fingertips is really helpful. It's really helpful knowing exactly what's going on, in the monetary system without having to rely on an intermediary to report it. You mentioned Visa. I think of the banking system too.
right.
The entire banking system is really our current intermediary. From the public's perspective, particularly in the West and America, trading our personal bank accounts and our personal cash for a government-controlled system, I agree, is far-fetched right now, and I think a lot of people would think it's anti-American and
Yeah, and you're actually
really
seeing
treacherous.
a lot of the proposals in the U.S. are to still maintain intermediaries
Oh, okay.
that would use visas. For example, they've got a big research project going, and would be the intermediary, and then this would get settled behind the scenes with the central bank.
Ah.
So,
So
so I think there are ways to
who are the
do it.
parties making these proposals?
There's been the Fed has actually done some research on this and looked at central bank digital currencies in a study. And so all bankers are looking at this as a way to kind of modernize. So there's not only the retail central bank digital currencies that you and I might use, but wholesale central bank digital currencies that might be used for bank to bank settlements. So right now we use either the ACH system, and when your check clears and all that kind of stuff, or you use the SWIFT system internationally. And those can be expensive systems to transfer and maintain, and they can be relatively slow. And so the idea is that you could modernize the settlement process and drive a lot of efficiencies there. So Visa is actually proposing a lot of this as well. But how do we? I think in the U.S. or in Western countries, we will see the maintaining of these private intermediaries, both from a trust perspective and also just frankly from an incumbent provider perspective, right? So they're going to lobby to have themselves in the middle of all these transactions. And you could argue whether that's good or bad, but that's I think the case.
Right, right. So you've got some countries that have rolled this out unsuccessfully. Nigeria might be an example of that. We have other countries who are maybe farther out from actually using something like this, like Britain and the U.S. And then we have other countries that have rolled out CBDCs more successfully, and China is probably a pretty good example of that, right? How is China using this today?
So they've been using it mainly internally. So they've been providing airdrops into people's wallets. So have been using this as a form of currency exchange. And of course, the thing that concerns everybody there is that they also have this idea of a social credit score, so that you get scored based on your activity, your purchasing activity, facial recognition technology. They also use uh, uh, facial recognition technology to identify ethnicity as well. So the Uyghur people in the West have been highly prosecuted because they have a religious belief in Islam. So, but they prosecute anybody basically that has any sort of religious belief, but this is associated with this particular ethnicity. And so they have facial recognition cameras that can identify these folks. And so being able to say, okay, well, you are of a class of people we don't like, you don't make as much money, you can't buy, you can't use your money in a certain way, you can't buy certain tickets on trains. Other people think it's a good thing because maybe Scott is just a jerk. He's got money and he's able to not obey the rules. Now we have a system that can catch him and can algorithmically punish him for his poor behavior. So we also have to realize that we have a Western perspective on these things, and so not everybody in China is like, "Oh my God, this is horrible." Some of them, think, "Oh yeah, this is a good idea." So I think that we're going to see that. I'm really worried about how this could be weaponized against by dictators. One of the things that's been disappointing for me is seeing the internet come about in the 90s, and freedom on the internet. There's a report that comes out every year, and it's actually showing that freedom is going down. There's more and more government censorship. In India, they take down different websites or block different websites that are in opposition to the current prime minister. This it's how these things can be weaponized to maintain control and are anti-democratic. So I think it gets tied up into a whole lot of issues, right, that we might be thinking of.
Yeah, absolutely. You wrote on your Substack a while back a really good example of how this is currently being used in China, and I'll probably bastardize my description of it, but as I recall it, you have two different people. We call them Fred and Joe, and Fred's a really scrupulous person. He gets 8 hours of sleep every night. He doesn't consume very much alcohol, which is why he's able to sleep. He goes to the political rallies of the correct party, not the incorrect party. He doesn't jaywalk, and so when he goes to the store and he wants to buy a liter of beer or something like that, it costs him, like, let's call it $10. But then for the second guy, Joe, he is less scrupulous. He's out until 3 a.m. every night. He drinks his face off. He goes to the political rallies of the wrong party, and he jaywalks all the time. And for him, the first liter of beer might cost him $10, but if he buys a second within a couple of days, it might cost him $25, and then $500. Right? So these are all ways that such a system can be applied to get what the government is after, which a lot of Americans would clearly not be on board with. Did I do justice to that example? Is that
No, that's a great example. That's really where you can see the marriage of these two technologies. So
right?
right now, they do limit purchases, but they don't adjust them on the fly that way. So your social credit score is tied to your ability to get, for example, first class train tickets or plane tickets, things like that, or tickets at all. But it's not, but you could imagine it being that kind of social governor, right? So can we modify behavior? Can we fuse social policy and fiscal policy as well, or monetary policy, I guess. So
Right, right. And the other thought that comes to mind with that aspect in particular is we have, and this is an element we haven't talked about yet, rising wealth inequality here in the US, and that's been a consistent trend for quite a while. And as you put it, if you're somebody who doesn't jaywalk, but gets upset with the people who do well in their free enterprise and get away with jaywalking, then perhaps there's some intersection of your interest in this CBDC kind of setup to where it would benefit you and maybe have-nots more than the haves. Again, this is not a fully fleshed out thought, but just
yeah, and
came to mind.
I think that the U.S. and Europe is going to be behind on this because we do have relatively stable monetary policy, and
Yeah.
the U.S. dollar is the reserve currency of the world and is used in the exchange of transactions. So we have a lot of stability. So we're not seeking out something different. But I think those countries that have different problems, such as you mentioned, are going to be seeking out, some alternative to. Whether it's something like Bitcoin. We also saw, what was it, El Salvador? I kind of forgot to follow up with that. That the guy, the president there, adopted Bitcoin as the official currency. I don't think that worked out very well.
I
But
saw I haven't followed it closely either, but I saw a headline maybe 2 weeks ago that where the president claimed that decision has them now net positive, and that the Bitcoin on the country's balance sheet is now worth more than when they acquired it.
Okay, interesting.
Take for that what you will. It's a young, kind of boisterous, loud party animal
Yes,
dude, as I recall, and he's somewhat radical, and
he's the Sam Bankman-Fried of
yeah, right, El Salvadorian
of
Sam
El Salvador.
Bankman-Fried.
Great.
Well, Scott, this has been great. I really enjoy talking with you. I love having you on the show. I feel like you get into professor lecture mode, which I don't mean to sound pejorative at all. I really enjoy that, and your teaching hat just goes on, because all the stuff I am adjacent to in my day-to-day job. It's relevant to what we do, but I am clearly not an expert in any of it, and I just really appreciate you elaborating and explaining some of these topics for the benefit of our listeners.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed being on here.
So how can people find you that want to keep up with what your interests are, and if they want to learn more about CBDCs and AI and crypto in general,
Sure.
how can they find you?
Sure. I have a link tree that is just profc news.com. And if you go to that, you'll find actually some resources to link to from some of my workshops I've been doing about generative AI with students and faculty, as well as all the ways to connect with me, from email and texting to my Substack, as you mentioned. I've also been putting a lot of stuff on YouTube. One, just to I try and get my students to be uncomfortable by trying new things. And so I'm also getting uncomfortable. It's hard. It is hard, man. It's like, you're out there, on the street trying to do a little video, or in the library, and you feel so self-conscious, but I'm getting out there and trying it. And all my topics are on generative AI. And so you'll see ones that are about my opinion about these technologies, or a paper that came out, or they might just be, how do you get started? So how do you get started with Google Bard? How do you get started with their extension for searching YouTube videos, stuff like that? So I'm always looking for feedback and how to get better, if they're wanting to check out my YouTube.
Right on. I think it's great that you're taking jumps that make you a little bit uncomfortable. I think that's a really important component of life, regardless of how old you are or what you're doing. And it's refreshing to hear that other people feel self-conscious when they're recording a video in public, because I sure do whenever I have to do it.
Yeah, it looks easy. Let me tell you, those students that have YouTube channels, I give them a lot of credit.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks again for taking the time and making us a little wiser today than we were at the beginning of the hour. I hope you'll come back on again at some point down the road.
Certainly. Well, hopefully, I'll talk to you again in a year or two. That seems like a good increment.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
Thanks for tuning in to Grow Money Business, the podcast dedicated to helping business owners optimize income, pay less in tax, and invest prudently. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Google, Spotify, or wherever you digest podcasts to ensure you don't miss out on future episodes and announcements, and feel free to submit questions to growmoneybusiness.com.